One of the central parts of Return of the Jedi's story is Luke Skywalker's possible fall to the dark side of the Force. That's probably no secret, but some of you guys might not know that if you haven't looked at some of the behind the scenes stuff or seen interviews with George about the making of the movie. The reason that Luke wears all black is so he would look like Vader and to imply to the audience that he might become evil at the end. Luke goes on a journey with the Force as he trains to become a Jedi over the course of the trilogy, and in Return of the Jedi, he faces his final test and must choose between the light and dark sides of the Force. The novelization of Return of the Jedi is great, and my favorite part of the book is how it really fleshes out Luke's thoughts and reveals where he stands mentally at the start of the story. It turns out he was a lot closer to the dark side than we all realized. When he entered Jabba's palace to save his friends, he was like a little Vader Jr. in his head. Even in the movie, Luke says a lot of aggressive and ominous stuff to Jabba, like, "I warn you not to underestimate my powers, this is the last mistake you'll ever make, free us or die," stuff like that. That's not stuff that a Jedi would typically say. Well, it turns out that the novelization explains why he really wanted to kill Jabba the Hutt. When Luke entered Jabba's palace, he was older and wiser than before. He had lost many things, but he had gained knowledge. Through the Force, he could see a lattice of space and time, of shadows and corners that lent perspective to things. It gave way to a certain darkness in his personality. He was much more skilled in the way of the Jedi now, but the dark side also felt closer to him than ever before. When two of Jabba's guards blocked his path, he held up his hand and used force choke on them, sending them backwards, clutching at their throats. And the novelization actually states that they were choking. I know a lot of people like to argue that he didn't use force choke, but the book states that he made them choke, so that's a dark side ability, so that just shows that Luke was closer to the dark side and he was acting like Vader. Anyway, when he was brought before Jabba, Luke saw Leia chained at the neck and dressed in the costume of a dancing girl, and he was furious. He could feel Leia's pain in the Force immediately, but he didn't say anything, didn't even look at her, and he shut her anguish completely out of his mind. He had to focus his attention entirely on Jabba, practicing the discipline and emotional control necessary of a Jedi Knight. Luke requested a bargain for Han Solo's release and warned Jabba not to underestimate his powers. As we know, Jabba was not interested in listening or bargaining, and Luke was forced to face the Rancor. But the most interesting part comes afterward, when Han, Leia, Chewie, and Luke were all taken prisoner and brought before Jabba. 3PO announced that they would all be taken to the Sarlacc in the Great Pit of Carkoon, but Luke only smiled and told Jabba that he should have bargained and it was the last mistake he would ever make. Luke was unable to suppress the satisfaction in his voice. He found Jabba despicable, a leech of the galaxy, sucking the life from whatever he touched. Luke wanted to kill the villainous gangster, and so was actually glad that Jabba had refused to bargain, because now he would get his wish. But in the process, to free the galaxy of this criminal slug, that was a prospect that tinted Luke's purpose with a dark satisfaction. That is straight up the influence of the dark side right there. That is hatred, anger, violence. That is Luke giving into the desires of the dark side, the influence, the emotions of the dark side of the Force. And we do know that it was actually Leia that ended up killing Jabba during the battle at the Pit of Carkoon, since Luke was fighting on the skiffs and then on Jabba's barge, so he didn't actually get to do what he wanted, but I find it crazy that Luke was having such violent and dark thoughts. I really enjoy this lore that the novelization provides. These details are fascinating, and I think it's crazy that Luke was thinking like this. Even though this is from the novelization of Return of the Jedi, which is from 1983, so obviously the prequels were not written yet, this is very similar to how Anakin acted and thought in the prequels. I also find it fascinating that Luke felt this way about Jabba, because in the prequel lore, we now know that Anakin and his mother were owned by Gardulla the Hutt. So once you connect all the lore in the continuity and you look at the timeline, you could think that Luke learned a little bit about his family and learned that his father and grandmother were the slaves of Gardulla the Hutt on Tatooine, and maybe that's another reason why he hated Jabba, hated the Hutts, and that's why he was so influenced by the dark side when he went into Jabba's palace, and he just couldn't control himself, and that's why he was acting so dark and so much like Vader in those scenes. Even so, without these details from the book, it's very evident that Luke is acting a lot different in the movie, just at face value, and that's completely intentional. If you read any behind the scenes stuff, like in the books The Star Wars Archives or The Making of Return of the Jedi, all of that is intentional by George. He wanted Luke to act like Vader so that the audience would think he might turn to the dark side. That's the whole point. That's why Luke wears all black, and then at the end of the film, the flap on his tunic falls open and it's white underneath to show that he was always going to stay on the light side. And I feel like a lot of people don't really realize that there's really that potential for Luke to turn to the dark side. I mean, there was even an alternate ending that George considered and Mark Hamill suggested, where Luke put Vader's helmet on and said that he was Vader at the end of Return of the Jedi. So that's something that they considered going with. And I think that the way that the book describes it is obviously much more heavy-handed. It's much more like, oh yeah, this seems like Luke could turn evil at the end of this book. In the movie, it's not that obvious, but I'm glad that the book describes it the way it did, and that's why I wanted to make this video. I also just found it interesting that Luke wanted to kill Jabba the Hutt so bad. But I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. Make sure to like and subscribe if you did, and as always, may the Force be with you.